Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Magdalena Buchek, and I am the school consultant to Pelham Schools. I work at Cognitive Behavioral Consultants, where I do a wide range of therapeutic services, including CBT, DBT, PCIT, and a big role is consulting to schools. I am here today to talk to you all about how to support your families in this transition back to in-person learning. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of an overview. Primarily, we will be talking a lot about emotions and all the emotions that make sense in this transition back to in-person learning. Think, top emotion of 2020 and well into 2021 really is anxiety. So we'll talk a little bit about what anxiety looks like, how worry and in the face of uncertainty, how it's presenting in your children and ourselves as adults. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is, what's typical, what's not, and what we can do about it. So we'll touch on some coping strategies and self-care for parents and for your children. We'll talk a little bit about communication. So how can we effectively communicate with our children about anxiety and uncertainty in this transition back to school? And then talking about that transition. So thinking about how to address stressors, right, that might create vulnerabilities for an increase in emotions and might impact your children's functioning. So we'll give you some strategies on how to decrease those vulnerabilities in this transition. So when it comes to thinking about emotions, emotions are really connected to the way that we think, right? Which then impacts how we behave, right? And it's also interrelated with how our body responds to a given situation. So this is an important conceptualization to keep in mind because even though, we might focus often on behaviors and what we want to change, often a lot of the strategies, when it comes to managing difficult situations, will target things like emotions and our thinking and also ways to keep our bodies calm. All of it is interrelated and can really reduce vulnerabilities during difficult times, including going back to school still in the midst of a pandemic. Right? We all experience this fight or flight system that sets off various alarms and responses within our body, which can then really impact how we respond to situations. So we'll talk a little bit about some strategies that can prevent this fire alarm system from going off a little too soon. So we've been seeing now that we're kind of more than a year into the pandemic that it really has been a mental health crisis for parents, right? So not just thinking about how we're being impacted emotionally from job insecurity to financial challenges to managing working from home or working in situations that might get us exposed to the virus, loss with our families, different health impacts. And it's really, the way that we've been experiencing the pandemic, can't imagine even like what it's been like to be a kid, right? So a lot of the research now is starting to demonstrate, this increase in children expressing anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms. So this particular article highlighted a study coming out of Harvard that we have 5, 6, 7-year-olds endorsing feeling nervous, anxious, and on edge, right? This has also, really impacted the way parents experience emotions and everything that they're juggling. So this transaction between parental stress, children's stress is really making us vulnerable in this next transition, this next stage of the pandemic where we are really trying to get things back to normal. So this is an important piece to keep in mind because these vulnerabilities after a year of experiencing this level of distress really does make us more susceptible to continued distress, even as things begin to get slightly more normal. So to start thinking about concerns, we've been hearing a lot about, children expressing worry thoughts. about their social relationships. We've been hearing some concerns about academic functioning, obviously health concerns now being around, more people, from adults to other kids. So, you know, um, we'll try to address different concerns as they come up. And if there are things that continue to come up, please remember to contact your administration. So, really important to keep in mind, what are some common reactions to expect in this time, right? So, this combination of still being in the midst of a pandemic while also transitioning back to an experience that children really haven't had, in over a year. And at the same time, it's a very different experience. So, a lot of symptoms that we might see in our kids and in ourselves, typically not in a pandemic, would have been, causes for concern a lot sooner. I just want to think in the context of what you all are going through. These might be some common things to see. So, children may exhibit separation anxiety from parents and from teachers, right? Especially, let's say, if situations arise where quarantine needs to happen, or there might be some staff changes going on. Children might express anxiety related to leaving common people in their lives. They might regress in previously mastered stages of development. So, we might start to see things like bedwetting, having difficulty at bedtime. So, one of the coping strategies we'll talk a little bit later is like restructuring bedtime, because sleep is such a huge vulnerability. But given that, school starts early, bright and early in the morning, a lot of us know that we experience a lot of worry thoughts and physical symptoms at night. So, this might disrupt bedtime. We might have increased physical complaints, right? So, we might see increases in headaches, stomach aches, feeling nauseous, either urges to undereat, so decreases in appetite. For some, it might be actually increases in appetite. And children might develop new fears. This might not even be related to getting sick or anything related to school, but random things might pop up. Maybe it's a fear of the neighbor's dog or a bug or being scared of the dark. It is not uncommon to start to see new fears developing in such a stressful transition. They might ask questions about death and dying, right? We are continue to be exposed to news, and again, this isn't the end of the pandemic. So, questions depending on what exposures children experience, whether it's also hearing about loved ones getting sick. It is very common for kids to wonder about death and dying, and that does not mean that they might be experiencing suicidal thinking. They might have more difficulty with authority, right? So, when we are in a stressful situation and our fight or flight systems get activated, there's another F word in that system that comes up. It is the fight system, right? So, when we're thinking about stress, it also can increase irritability. And when we are more irritable, we're more likely to be defensive and we're more likely to be rigid. So, we might see some difficulties with authority. So, what that might look like is not difficulties with rule following, increased saying no, refusal to do certain activities they might more typically be able to do without a problem. But again, very common. Makes sense from a biological standpoint with that one. They might overreact to criticism. So, thinking about our systems being more sensitive to emotions because of that fight or flight system, our camera lens might be more reactive to anything we hear in negative, right? So, for example, if a student might get some corrective feedback, even as for something like, fix your mask, or maybe it is related to something academic, a child might have an exaggerated response to some feedback. Very common. Again, from that biological standpoint of just being up in arms. So, higher reactivity is totally expected, which brings us to being more jumpy, more physiologically activated. They might show less trust in others, which again can come to like if there are changes with staff members, they might be, afraid, might express some concerns, and they might be continuing to ask for more screen time. Screen time is an effective way to avoid feeling emotions. It provides that distraction, so kids do feel better on screens, which makes sense. So it can lead to a little bit more avoidance. It is important to keep in mind that what is typical for younger kids is very similar to what is typical to what you might be experienced in this time, right? You might be experiencing less motivation, increased irritability, increased sadness, increased anxiety and worry, right? Like we vicariously live through our kids. So the emotions they might be experiencing, we might be experiencing. You might notice feeling fatigue. You are constantly on from managing home life, work life, now transitioning to school, all the stress that comes with that. Might notice increased feelings of guilt, changes in appetite, difficulties with concentration because of the constant overload of information, of decision making, of problem solving, of issues popping up, and in noticing our own increases in physiological distress. So headaches and stomach aches are common. I, had the urge to write living in the new normal. I refuse to treat this as like living in the new normal. We are living in a pandemic. It is very different. And we do not necessarily know, what changes might, have a more permanent impact. So we have to stay focused on the present moment. The emotions that are normative for this time include sadness and anxiety, right? Not They are normal for in general for human existence, even in childhood. And during a time like right now, emotions that make sense, right? Sadness, anxiety, disappointment, and positive emotions, right? The excitement of returning to school, of seeing people that we haven't seen in a really long time, or re-engaging in activities that haven't been present in our lives for so long. What's normative is children may continue to feel isolated from their friends, even though they might start seeing their friends physically. It takes some time to readjust engaging with their friends. Thinking about, this time they might have been more long distance friends and now they are spending more time together. It might take some time to get reacquainted. Children may express missing things that are normal or more typical routines, right? So you might hear complaints about how recess is going, how lunch is going, or how they miss certain games or things that they did in gym, or even, continued complaints about mask wearing, all very common. So that there's almost like this grief component of what used to be and how things are. Very typical. Worrying about whether things will ever go back to normal, right? That comes with this fear related to that uncertainty. And, unfortunately, uncertainty really has been such a big component to our experiences in the past year. We'll continue to worrying about health and safety of different family members, anxiety about contracting COVID. We're taking a quick pause in the presentation, given the fact that there was some technical difficulties in the information sent out to you all. So hopefully we'll get a couple of more parents to join. The part one of the presentation will be posted on your websites. It just was some introductory things, so you guys have not yet really missed the bulk of the presentation. If questions, concerns arise, chat them to Julia and I, and we'll try to answer them. I'll pick up here. So we were just talking about some normative experiences of what to expect as your children transition back to school. So some things you might, what children might continue to feel are continued feelings of isolation, some worry thoughts about uncertainty of the future, Now being around, so many more people, anxiety about contracting COVID or spreading it to others. I recently had my first experience of traveling and just like being in a public space with that many people. Notice my own panic symptoms, even though like cognitively, like I kept reminding myself
Hold on,
of,
I have to turn
you
that
know,
off.
of my safety. It still was really hard to not experience anxiety being around more people. It's not something we've been used to. Excitement to see loved ones now and friends in school, again, like with exposure both like at school and then also in your families, and continued uncertainty, right, about like whether or not there might be more lockdowns or there might be a need to quarantine and your schedule and your school routine might be disrupted yet again. What I want as parents, like for you to be mindful about, is that in this pandemic, and it typically in any transition, when we're thinking about childhood mental health, we are looking at a little bit of like an expanded timeline for noticing certain concerning symptoms. So whereas for adults, if we're noticing changes in the mood, increases in social withdrawal, impacts on functioning, for adults we're looking at about 2-3 weeks. For children, we might see declines in emotional functioning before we put a diagnosis on it, or there is a need for seeking out more support. We're looking at a window of about a month, right? So children might be experiencing heightened emotions and behaviors out of their typical character, I think, for about those like 3-4 weeks before we would recommend taking things to the next level and intervening further. So things to look out for. Think in terms of if you're being mindful to signs of your children being sad or increase in depressive symptoms, we would be seeing complete social withdrawal or lack of interest in activities that typically would excite them. Significant academic decline, so not engaging in school. So that might include school refusal, refusal to complete assignments. Now, intermittent refusal here and there, very common during this time. Consistently refusing to participate in school-related activities for a month, definitely cause for concern. Self-critical thoughts. So if your child does not typically express thoughts such as like, I'm so stupid, or I can't do this, why can't I do this, I'm a terrible friend, intermittent statements like that, normative. Continued repetition and beliefs around being stupid, not being good enough for about those 3-4 weeks, more of a red flag, cause for concern. So in this transition, when we're thinking about anxiety that's normative versus then turning into chronic avoidance, right? We want to honor that so many events in the past year have been scary for all of us, right? And communities contribute to that anxiety, whether it's from the news or a single, story events that we hear, like through the grapevine of, my friend's sister tested positive, or, somebody knows of somebody that passed away. That can really amplify anxiety. So what we're, again, trying to look out for is when it starts to really have a significant impact on your functioning. So it might then lead to increased avoidance of people, places, and activities. Some avoidance, again, is going to be normative in this transition back, right? So the first couple of experiences, the first time you might go back to a restaurant, a specific class, and a specific activity, makes sense that there might be urges to avoid, maybe even like a birthday party, things like that. Those first couple of re-entry experiences might be linked to refusal to participate. If this continues to be problematic, then we would want to re-examine possibly getting more support. Anxiety is a normal part of experience, right? Those urges to avoid are typical, right? So we'll give some strategies on how to support students emotionally to help them engage. but chronic avoidance is not. So that would be a huge red flag for when to increase supports for students. The bottom line, before we now like talk about coping strategies on how to support your students, is that we are still operating in a crisis, in crisis mode, right? So this really is akin to being, in a chronic trauma stressor. Our fight or flight systems have been activated now like for more than a year, right? So that burnout, right, is big vulnerability factor for us as parents and our students, right? And so we want to honor that and keep that in mind because it is going to make things more challenging. And we do have strategies that we can be mindful of that to minimize, right, the impact of these chronic stressors that you and your kids are facing, as we go back to school in person. So, what can you do? Right? A lot of the supports and laying the foundation in this transition really will come from the home. And it will start with you modeling adaptive coping. Right? So, what might that look like? I'm going to put a heavy emphasis on emotions, right? In this transition, what I want you to think about as like a foundation is honoring emotions. Emotions are challenging to talk about, and our children, our young children, might not necessarily have the skills to express what they're feeling. So that guidance is going to come from you. One tip to kind of maybe consider incorporating into your family's routine is an emotional family check-in. So scheduling a time, it doesn't have to be super long, 1 to 5 minutes, to intentionally welcome and accept emotional experiencing, right? So this might start from you modeling that emotional expression. So it might say like, today, it, I felt, really sad. Today I struggled. I wasn't able to, let's say, make the dinner that I wanted to, or, unfortunately, I didn't get to finish the work task that I had. I'm feeling really disappointed. Today my stomach hurt because I was really feeling nervous, about your return to school. So what we want to do is model emotional expression, and how we might want to even check in with ourselves, or the questions we want to ask our kids is, what are you feeling today? Maybe checking in, like, kind of focusing on strengths, like what went well today? What were you able to do in the classroom? Who did you see? And honoring what was hard, right? What might have led to some disappointment? Checking in on, was there anything that made you feel sad today? Where in your body might have you felt nervous, right? If your stomach hurt, if you maybe notice having a headache or notice feeling distracted, that makes sense. Which brings us to thinking about, in this transition, how do we reduce vulnerabilities, right? So part of it is honoring emotions, and we'll talk a little bit about validation on the next slide, I believe. But from a vulnerability standpoint, given the fact that our nervous systems have been in overdrive, right? Facing so many different challenges, transitions, and factors, a lot of the disruptions that we might see will be in our routines. So when we think about reducing vulnerabilities to kind of target the physiological responses we might experience, tip number one is to focus on sleep. Given that we might see some disruptions in bedtime, or maybe now that kids can't necessarily, sleep longer and roll out and just hop on their computers, they might need earlier wake up times. And I'll give an example of how to restructure that sleep. I think really big on sleep hygiene, right? So whether that might mean, winding down a little bit sooner, consistency is going to be key. So if you can develop a fun new routine to implement and try and do every single day, after about, 2 weeks of applying it consistently, it will help reduce that sleep vulnerability. Sleep impacts attention. It can make us more vulnerable to experiencing strong emotions. It affects concentration. So if there's anything that we can target from an intervention standpoint, would be sleep. Limiting screen time. So this goes from both like pleasurable, like enjoyable games and activities on screens, but also continuing to be mindful of news exposure, right? Being flooded with facts can be very overwhelming, for kids when they don't necessarily understand the facts. So just being mindful of what our children are exposed to. Recommend definitely at least limiting electronics 1 hour before bedtime, just to, again, not interfere with the sleep. Eating healthy. Being at home definitely has made all of us more vulnerable to unstructured eating, right? So increase like snacking on the go, maybe not necessarily eating full meals, because stronger emotions that might arise in this transition might also impact appetite. It is really important to try and structure meals. So really encouraging our kids to, eat a complete breakfast. They might we can't necessarily control how much they'll eat at lunch for lunch at school, because that's going to look a little different, but also making sure that they are at least attempting to eat the three structured meals and some snacks. Coping ahead, I'll elaborate on the next slide a little bit more, but part of doing that emotional check-in, identifying a consistent sleep routine is checking in with our kids on what might be stressful the next day and coming up with an action plan in advance, so we could talk about it, imagine it, and have more concrete action steps to decrease the vulnerability for feeling anxious about the uncertainty. So I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. And having fun. I mean, COVID has definitely robbed a lot of opportunities for fun and activities that we, typically use for stress relief. So thinking about how can we incorporate some structured fun that kids can look forward to, right? Anything that's going to be new, and again, continued uncertainty as that vulnerability still looms above all of us. Having something that's consistent to look forward to, maybe your kids don't necessarily have, Tuesday and Thursday night dance classes, swim classes, or things just look different, to even have some routine family fun activities planned, as whether it's throughout the week or, having something consistently to look forward to on the weekends. Those pleasant activities can reduce that vulnerability towards sadness, can increase some hope and motivation for having things to look forward to. This goes for parents as well. So, really being mindful to your own self care and vulnerabilities when it comes to sleep, screen time, eating healthy, and incorporating some activating activities. So examples of if sleep has been a little off, a little wonky during this time, it is totally, totally common. So we can take some action steps towards reworking the structure around sleep. So thinking about ideal anchor points for wake up time and bedtime and keeping those consistent, that is going to be really helpful. Putting away electronics earlier. So, maybe thinking about how might you model doing that in front of your kids as well, almost having like a family, all right, electronics get shut down, at 7 o'clock, right? We put them away here, having a special spot for them. So everyone's on the same page. Thinking about then having consistent wind down time as it comes to like bath and showering, and thinking about incorporating a calming activity. So maybe that is reading a book, doing a mindfulness exercise. So you can find various videos on YouTube. You can look up mindfulness boot camp that was created for schools, has some helpful guided meditations for kids. Thinking about looking into the Calm app or Headspace for examples of mindfulness exercises, maybe even doing like a family stretch to loosen up the tension that we're carrying all day long, and that can prepare the body for sleep. Maybe even it is just simply breathing together for 2 minutes. A calming activity, again, can give our bodies the signal that it might be time to go to sleep, and having a consistent lights out. So that might be some structure to add to your sleep routines to target if bedtime is becoming problematic for you or if morning wake up time is problematic. Typically, we would need at least like 1 to 2 weeks of consistency in that routine to see some effects. With coping ahead, we want to actually have you come up with an action, collaborate with your kids on an action plan. Some questions to keep in mind, and most importantly, is having our kids identify the situation that might trigger a strong feeling. Maybe it's recess. Maybe it is, seeing a particular teacher that they haven't seen in a long time. What might they feel in that situation? So having the students already label that in advance is part of increasing our awareness to that and can, be enough of an intervention. Then we want to brainstorm some coping skills, right? What can you do in that situation when you feel nervous seeing your friend or when you feel nervous approaching your friend at recess, right? Imagine, what are you going to say? Let's pretend that we're in that situation right now. So, what might you think? How might you feel? You might notice not wanting to approach your friend. What can you do in that situation? Maybe it's taking a deep breath, right? Or maybe it's saying, like, I got this, right? I'm feeling anxious and I can go ahead and say hello. Maybe you might be coping ahead as a family for a stressful morning, right? So maybe part of your cope ahead plan will be physical prep. So what that might mean is picking out an outfit and laying it out in advance, having your backpack packed, the night before. Maybe it's even creating reminders, right? When we're really anxious, it's hard to pay attention. And we might notice our kids saying, like, what time are we getting up? Will we have breakfast? When are we going to leave for school? Are you going to pick me up? What time is that going to be at? Creating a visual schedule can be really helpful in alleviating a lot of the stress. Maybe we can create one together, color it, design it together, a visual cue for your schedule the next day, or even thinking about structuring your environment if you're coping ahead for doing homework after school. Maybe it's creating a little bit of a schedule for what it might look like in your after school hours. Cannot recommend visual reminders enough because that alleviates a lot of reassurance seeking and question asking and approaching you to get those answers. And again, if there are any questions about anything that I'm saying or questions might pop up, feel free to chat them so that Julia and I can answer them. Tip number 3, increase reinforcement. What if I can get my kid to go to bed earlier or hand in their electronics earlier, or do their homework or get up on time or eat breakfast, right? What we want to do kind of from a foundational standpoint is focus on what they are doing. So what we want to pay attention to is, what are their kids doing right? Going back to our vulnerabilities as a parent, because we are in overdrive and we are feeling stress, we're more likely to be negative Nancy's and identify what isn't going well. They're not cleaning, they're not doing their chores, they're missing assignments, right? Our camera lens tends to focus on the negative. So we want to make sure that we're focusing enough on the positive. Make sure that your praises are specific. What are you saying great job for? What are you saying thank you for? Great job for getting out of bed. Thank you for packing up your backpack. Thank you for eating dinner with me today. I really appreciated spending time with you. So really focusing on the praises. If behaviors continue to be challenging, consider reasonable and realistic rewards. Now, we don't mean like, thinking about this as a bribery. We just mean that it makes sense that kids, when we're kickstarting a behavior, right, we need increases in motivation, right? When, in a pandemic, when I think back to like, accepting that I had to work out at home after sitting for a year, I wasn't going to be like, oh, I am going to just work. I'm going to work out for an hour a day, 7 days a week. Like, no way. So I needed some increases in motivation and also rethinking my goal, right? So this is where, we want to think about shaping behavior and managing those expectations, right? So if going to bed on time isn't going to be perfect and it's not going to be all 7 days, maybe we just focus on meeting the goal of 3 days a week, getting to bed, by the desired hour, and incentivizing it with maybe a special breakfast the next day if you go to bed on time, right? So lots of reinforcement with praise and considering small rewards, right? The rewards aren't going to be permanent. We just want to create some traction with new behaviors. Just because your child might not be engaging in things that they used to engage easily in does not mean that they do not care, that they are lazy or can no longer do it. We are in a pandemic, we are in a transition. Everything's out of sort, right? So change is going to not be smooth sailing. There will be lots of ups and downs. It is very hard for you and for us when it comes to change. So just make sure that you're, creating realistic goals for your kids and providing some additional incentives if it's extra hard. Remember to not reward avoidance, right? So if you might have a student, a kid who is outright refusing to go to school on a day, and say we throw in the towel and say, okay, you're staying home. This does not mean you get to spend the day cuddling, right? Doing extra activities, going out for a milkshake, having your special breakfast, keeping Netflix on all day. That day will be treated as a regular school day, which means, passwords get taken away from electronics that, equal fun. We're going to do academic stuff between the school hours, right? We're going to maintain that structure. So just being mindful that we're not rewarding avoidance. Tip number 4, kind of tying back to conversations about emotions. Focus on validation. I'm going to talk about this first before we talk about problem solving. As parents, our natural inclination is to be problem solvers. We want to fix things. So before we even understand how our child is feeling, we have solutions for what we can do to make the problem better. So what we end up doing in those situations is we miss the emotional component, which over time, that invalidation can actually make your child's emotion dysregulation worse. So if there's anything that I want you to take away from this presentation is focus on the emotions, validate, right? Acknowledge, validation is acknowledging that how you're feeling, right? What you might be thinking about and what those action urges might be makes sense, is accurate and acceptable in a particular situation. An urge to go to school makes sense, right? If we're feeling really nervous, right? So validating that anxiety might come up, that we might be feeling sad that recess isn't the same, that we might not be experiencing things in the same way. A way that we can validate, right, is encouraging that emotional communication and modeling it yourself. Asking more targeted questions in that, family emotional check-in. Is there something that you were worried about or concerned about? And maybe, again, acknowledging your own anxieties about your kids returning to school. So acknowledging, I'm feeling nervous about these first couple of days, because transitions are hard. And on the flip side, I am also excited for you that you get to see all your friends. So modeling out that wide range of emotional experiences. Want you to focus on some self-validation for yourself and some other examples to validate your kids. Is reminder, we are still in the midst of a global crisis none of us have ever faced before. We don't have guidance on how to successfully transition back to school. You all survived like remote learning, that was all new, right? Things are ever changing. Things are really frustrating. This is all normal, right? It's normal to feel anxious. It's normal to feel frustrated. Following new rules and getting used to them is incredibly hard, right? That's something to remind your kids. Having, less time for lunch, recess not being the same, so tough. It makes sense that we're feeling sad that our kids aren't experiencing social situations the same way, or, miss a good chunk of a variety of different experiences. The constant need, being on edge of what might change, that makes sense that we're feeling frustrated. Or when, we get news that we have to quarantine again, or we might be exposed, there's so much surprise that comes along in, my favorite quote of the pandemic: during these unprecedented times. So now, when we validate first, tip number 5 is to remember to assess before you provide any sort of reassurance or problem solving, right? So again, thinking about that role of us being these problem solvers, we very often might offer suggestions to our kids. All you have to do, right, is just go, step foot into the building, and it's going to be okay, right? Or if they're feeling overwhelmed with homework, oh, just do math first, then we're going to do science, providing them those solutions. Like things like, it's going to be fine, it's going to be okay. Encouraging optimism, it can be helpful at times, and we want to keep that in mind, because we want our kids to think about that things are going to be better, and be to guarantee, and we can't reassure with 100% certainty that it's going to be okay, they're going to be fine when they go back to school, or we're going to have all the solutions for them when it pertains to things that are hard for them. That might be misleading, and it might be really invalidating, right? Thinking about optimism, I remember feeling optimistic in June 2020, and here we are. I don't know how I'm feeling about June 2021 yet. So, I remember that, people telling me like, oh, Magda, isn't it this working from home? It must be so great. Like, you have an infant, you get to spend so much more time together. Like, that was so invalidating to me, right? So like, the silver linings, our kids might not be ready to hear them yet. So just focus on the present moment. And if you're noticing, right, that there might be something of concern, maybe you're noticing your kids struggling, I want you to assess first, right? Maybe you label it, I see that you might be having a tough time. What's going on? Would you like any help? What can I support you with? Lead in with validation and assess what's going on first before we dish out any reassurance, right? Remember, like, summer is around the corner, it's almost June, it's going to be great. That might not necessarily be so encouraging to a kid who's stressed out about this week, right? So try and stay present, focus, assess first before you offer solutions. Cannot emphasize that enough. When in doubt, focus on the emotion and validate. Just validate. So practicing your own acceptance, self-validation, and self-care. This is, I think, my final tip. As parents, right, going back to our vulnerabilities, we are all on edge. Like, our buckets are really, really full, right? So anything might set us off, and we might want things to go perfectly well, right? It's shocking to me for myself that I have yet to be acclimated to the constant need for change this year. So we just have to keep focusing on that acceptance of rolling with what comes our way. We have to manage our expectations, which might require some adjusting. This is no longer, right, like trying to make like regular life become regular again. This isn't regular. This isn't normal. So, thinking about how your kids might have been, if it was last year, or like thinking about like fall 2019, or, times when things were different, your students, your kids might have had different responses. Same thing goes for you. I want you all to practice that acceptance, that validation of, you are all doing the best you can in this moment. And so are your kids, so are your partners, so are your teachers and your administrators. Like, we've never dealt with this. So, we have to learn new skills. Mistakes will be made. Hindsight is 2020. And we can think of like, well, things should have been X, Y, and Z. And that's not helpful because that keeps us in the past. It maintains irritability and resentment and frustration, right? And we also don't know what's going to happen in the future. So focusing on what we can accept in the present moment and reminding yourself of that, you're doing the best you can alleviate that vulnerability to, have high expectations, feel rigid, feel defensive, and stressed out. The less stress you might be experiencing, the more likely you are to model effective coping for your kids. Pandemic best looks different from non-pandemic best. Accepting that uncertainty. So asking yourself, what is in my control today? Cannot necessarily control what's going to happen, end of this week, end of next week, in May and June. Got to focus on what we have on hand. Practicing acceptance, right, of the things that you do not have control over in this moment. Maybe it is about spending time with your kids. Maybe it is about having this meal in peace and, having a conversation. Reminding yourself that when there is a really tough day or a tough couple of days, if things don't go the way that you plan, reminding yourself this too shall pass. This all absolutely does suck and you can get through it. If there are situations that you can problem solve, right? So if you are noticing, that there is a particular thing today that you can maybe brainstorm some solutions for. Maybe it is bedtime. Maybe it is you're structuring your approach to homework or sitting down and talking about tomorrow. That you can do, that you can control. So just asking yourself, what is something realistic that I can try and provide a solution for? Tackle it one step at a time, right? So I love this picture here of what is acceptance. Today it was raining. I work from home with a toddler. And, raining means, and I live in Brooklyn in an apartment. So raining means, yep, it's raining. Today is going to be the way that it is versus saying like, oh my God, another day, here we go. Be in the present moment, accept what you can, accept that you cannot control everything. So with that, I know again, we had some people join in late. If there are any questions and concerns, I'll take a couple of minutes, maybe answer some of them. In the beginning of the presentation, you just missed a brief intro, which you will be able to view on the school website. But yeah, with that, I also just, before we take any questions, there are lots of resources. Feel free to email me. If there is anything from an emotional standpoint, I can provide some feedback on. This National Center of for Trauma, they have a lot of helpful resources for how to support your kids through the coronavirus. And what I find to be really helpful, my colleagues at the Child Mind Institute in the city, they have helpful newsletters and blog posts about a variety of different emotions and different presentations. They've had so much amazing content on how to support kids through this pandemic. Whether it's remote learning or transitioning back to school, please feel free to check out their website.